In the last session, we discussed Roland Barthes' work, but we are not done yet because his analysis of Balzac's story Saracen, it also shows a very interesting method of analysis, and it also points to one very important direction in which structuralist narratology can move. And what exactly is the unique feature of this important work? It shows that even in structuralist criticism, an individual work can be very important.
Sir, the sound is very disturbing. It isn't very clear.
Okay, let me just check. Let me just check. Just a minute. Let me just check. Right, in the last session, we started discussing Roland Barthes' work SZ, which is
Sir, we can't hear you. There is no audio at all.
okay. No voice. No voice.
No
whatsoever?
voice. No voice, sir.
Just bear with me for 1 minute. I'll see. These problems can be there sometimes.
No, it's clear now. It's absolutely clear. We can continue.
Okay, is it clear? Who is saying it's not clear? Maybe it's not clear somewhere else. Is it? Okay, so now it's clear. Okay, so we resume our discussion of SZ, and you know that before we ended the last session, we talked about the concept of codes. That means all our experience of the world comes to us in certain codes. That means you always are trying to codify your experience, and those codes are everywhere. So that means from the beginning of our life on the planet, we see that those codes exist in some form or the other. And even when we talk about our modern life, that means our experience comes in a codified form. Those codes are always there. How we do certain things, how we talk, how we behave, say those codes of speaking, those codes of writing, those codes of dressing up, those codes of looking at things, that means those codes. So here Barthes discovered this important notion that there is nothing natural, and our experience of the world is also not natural. So if a particular point of view, if a particular class tried to pass off its message as something natural, then probably this was not a true picture of the world. And so here we see Barthes looking at the work of an important writer, who is an important writer in French classical tradition, Balzac, who is considered a writer who presents a very true picture of French society, especially aristocracy in France. But when Balzac is studied by Barthes, Barthes proves that Balzac uses number of codes, he uses number of devices, and he uses certain features of art. So it is not reality as such, but rather it is a technique which is there in Balzac's hands, and Balzac is using that technique to talk about his work. What are those 5 codes? And I have given you some notes. I have posted some notes on that WhatsApp page. You can see those codes. One important code is hermeneutic code, right? So what exactly is hermeneutic code? And then there is another code that is called proetic code. Yet another code is connotative code. And yet another code is code of signifiers. So what exactly is the meaning of all these 5 codes? Let us first search those codes in the notes which I have posted. Yes, here we are. So for example, first code, let us see hermeneutic code. Hermeneutic, and we have discussed hermeneutics in our lectures on phenomenology. So there we see that the word hermeneutics referred to interpretation. The word hermeneutics referred to understanding. So we take that meaning from there. Hermeneutic meaning understanding. What exactly is a hermeneutic code in a work? Hermeneutic code is a code where a certain question is raised, and then the writer sets out to answer that question. So in a work, a question is raised and the writer answers that question. Then there is another code that is called proetic code. These words are properly spelled in the notes that I have posted. Proetic code is basically code of actions. Characters are performing actions. They are doing certain things. So Barthes studies those actions of characters. So maybe actions of the characters also help advance the story. So first there was this code of raising questions, and then the writer trying to answer those questions. Hermeneutic code. And this is the other code, proetic code, where actions performed by characters are taken into account. We are not saying that these codes follow a certain sequence. No, these codes are there, and you can see that these codes are central to Balzac's work, but these quotes can possibly be used to talk about other works of literature as well. And here I must make another point, because we are talking about narratology and we are talking about different narratives. So please keep in mind that a study of narratology is as important for students of fiction as it is for students of television or students of films, because films are also forms of narratives, and most films are also based on some stories, based on some novels, and so are television serials. And that's why the methodology that is used in film studies, it shares a lot of common ground with methodology that is used in the study of fiction. So these codes, one can talk about these codes with reference to narratives used in films also. Although in films, that how aspect is also very important, how something is said. And hence that famous distinction between plot and story, which was introduced by Russian formalist critics, that is central to students of film studies. Plot, how something is said, rather than what is there. And this question will come up in our discussion of Gerald Genet's work, but that is for tomorrow. So second important code is rhetoric code, which is code of actions. And the third important code is the cultural code. That means when you are living in a world, you are also living a particular culture. And you know that culture, if a particular text is produced in India, and if a particular text is produced in Cuba, then since the text comes from two different cultures, so obviously there will be those cultural differences. So cultural code refers to whole system of knowledge and values invoked by the text. Any text invokes a kind of cultural knowledge. So even some of those famous sayings, some of those famous proverbs, they originate in a particular culture. Rome was not built in a day. Rome was not built in a day. Now, some kind of cultural knowledge was also required to understand this. And similarly, many of those codes, say for example, one particular code, one particular proverb, ulte baas bareli ko. Now this is also something which is language specific, region specific, but here you also have a kind of cultural knowledge which is required to understand this. Or in English, you have that famous proverb, sending coals to Newcastle. So that means a place where coal is there in abundance. Why would you say send coals there? And similarly, say ulte baas bareli ko, Bareilly is known for woodwork. It is known for furniture. And so because it is known for woodwork, it is known for furniture, and if you send those say woods or bass to Bareilly, then again that is the whole idea. But everyone does not know this. Even people from South India may not know this. And similarly, in different languages in South India, you'll have different proverbs where that kind of cultural knowledge is required. So cultural code basically requires all those signifiers, proverbs, and a whole system of cultural knowledge. So Balzac also invokes this code. He also uses this code. He also employs this code. So hermeneutic code, a question is raised and then answer is provided. Rhetoric code, actions performed by characters, different actions. And cultural code, knowledge of culture, proverbial wisdom, or in other words, say that entire system of knowledge. There is another code, code of connotations or connotative code you can say, and here certain words, certain signifiers, they provide some kind of hints. In a text, there may be certain signifiers, certain connotations which provide hints. So this is yet another code. And then there is this symbolic code. In Anglo-American criticism, you can say that this is the code which talks about theme, which talk about the idea or ideas which make a particular work. What is important about these codes is that they are coming from Roland Barthes. And Roland Barthes was a French theorist. An Anglo-American tradition also has a very strong tradition of writing interpretations, of producing interpretations of works. So maybe in the Anglo-American tradition, if you hear about qualities like ambiguity in a work, if you hear about the concept of connotations, if you hear about the concept of theme, if you hear about the concept of symbols, then many of those things actually overlap in these codes. Another view is possible that these 5 codes can be reduced maybe to 3 or 4 codes, or maybe there is not sufficient distinction between connotative code or cultural code. So maybe some codes are very distinct. Hermeneutic code, okay, this is code of question and answers. Or paradigmatic code, this is a code of actions. Maybe these 2 codes are very clear in their focus. And cultural code, of course, this also is clear. But the code which talks about themes and the code which talks about connotations, maybe we see a kind of overlap of categories. So these are the 5 codes. And Barth has also done something else in this study. He divided the text into certain reading units. And you know that we have been talking about certain basic units. We talked about the concept of function when we discussed prop. We talked about the concept of preposition when we talked about Todoro. And Barth also introduces an interesting idea, because Barth is also a master structuralist. That is the concept of reading units. And there is a word for this, lexias. Lexias, L-E-X-I-A-S. And this entire text of Balzac is divided into 561 lexias. It is divided into 561 lexias. Now, what is the meaning of 5 lexias? Reading units. Usually, a text is divided in terms of chapters, in terms of paragraphs, in terms of sentences. But Barth is not following that traditional division of chapters and paragraphs. No, Barth is dividing his text into reading units. So that means this is another kind of division which does not follow a paragraph or a page or a sentence or a chapter. Reading units, lexias. Furthermore, another important thing about this work is that it also offers in between many interesting digressions. And those digressions are important and interesting for their own sake, because they also provide some useful insights about works of literature. So, for example, just one digression. Think about one digression, and Barth knows that that is a digression. At one particular place in this book, SZ, Barth talks about the concept of second reading of a text. That means what happens when we read a story or a novel second time. And here also he offers his criticism of the publishing industry, which considers a work, a novel, a story as a kind of product. And if there is greater sale of those products, then obviously there will be greater profit for publishing industries. And how can it be done? By promoting the idea of reading something and then throwing it away, and then maybe picking up another book and then reading that and maybe throwing that also somewhere. And that means first reading is all that concerns publishers, because readers should always buy new books. But Barth talks about second reading, and he disagrees with this view that suspense is killed or tension is killed. Tension is no longer there. Suspense is no longer there when you read second time. No, he talks about a different kind of pleasure that one can get from reading a book second time. And I am reminded actually of the words of Oscar Wilde. He said that if you can read a book with interest for the first time, there is no reason why you should not read that book many times over. That is Oscar Wilde, right? By the way, I never thought about this connection, but both Oscar Wilde and Barthes, they will be considered hedonist. That means lover of beauty. So that means Barthes brings us to one very important point in criticism, where it is not simply the rules of all narratives which are important, but also one individual tale, one individual story, one individual film, how it realizes those rules. And so both become important. Individual tale, individual film, individual story, as well as the whole system, right? Now Barthes was, and this is my final comment, Barthes was a master performer. And structuralism also gives you different kinds of performers. And here there is another division within structuralism. This is not a very neat division, but one can talk about this division, that there is the high structuralism and there is also the low structuralism. Or there are highbrow structuralists and there are also lowbrow structuralists. Highbrow structuralists, they are master performers. So Barthes, for example, is that star figure. Jacques Lacan, famous psychoanalyst, he is a star performer. And Michel Foucault, who also talks about structures of history and all, he is also a star performer. But there are many, like for example Vladimir Trop. He was, say, not a star performer. Rather, he was not read in his time. It was only later that his work was discovered by others. It was considered important by others. There is yet another important name who you would call representing low structuralism, and that person is Gerald Genet. Gerald, Gerald, and Genette, Gerald Genet. Gerald Genet has been a very influential figure in structuralist theory, and for a number of reasons. You know that when structuralists were asked to provide reasons for their criticism, argument for their criticism, there were two important arguments. One important argument was that any narrative presents structures of human mind. That means when we study a particular narrative, then we are not simply studying that narrative also reveals structures of human mind, structures of universal human mind. That means this is an idea which is explored by Levi-Strauss. But there is another reason also, another argument also, and that argument is considered very, very sane. That argument is considered very convincing. And what is that argument? That argument is that once we are clear about the nature of a narrative, once we know what a narrative is, then we can also devise a terminology to talk about that narrative. Something very simple but significant. So what has happened in structuralist criticism and what has been a very important contribution of narratology is that now there is almost a kind of consensus about what forms a narrative, what exactly is a narrative, what are the elements which make a narrative, right? So the second aspect of this, if we know what a narrative is, can we have some very refined terminology to talk about those narratives? And here Gerald Gine is a very important figure. And now I am specifically addressing this question to research students or those MA students who plan to write something. So MA students, they are also writing their dissertation, they're also writing their term papers, and research students, when they get up at 11 o'clock, after that they think about writing something. So they are also
Assignment also.
in writing. So here what is important for writing is also familiarity with certain terms, a certain jargon which defines a particular area, a particular subject. And when we use the word jargon here, we are not using the word jargon in a pejorative sense. We are talking about the kind of specialized terminology which we must follow. And so here we are. What structuralist criticism has done, what narratology has done, and what Gerald Gine, more than any other critic, has done is to provide some terminology which can be used to talk about relationship between time and literature, all those traditional categories which were used in criticism of fiction, and also certain terms which talk about concepts like order, frequency, and all those details. And his work can be applied also to your analysis of maybe films, maybe novels that you read. So Gerald Gine we will discuss tomorrow, and as I said, there are two very important arguments in favor of structuralist criticism. The advanced one, that by studying those tales, by studying those narratives, we are also trying to know something about the functioning of universal human mind. And this argument was not considered convincing by everyone. But the second argument, that we must know what a narrative is, and once we know what a narrative is, we must have a proper terminology in which to talk about narratives. This is considered a very convincing argument, and this has been a very important contribution of Gerald Gine. So, for example, you know that Barthes provides some kind of terminology. We talk about those quotes. So the Thoreau provides some kind of terminology which you can use. Similarly, Propp talks about certain kind of terminology, and Gerald Gine also talks about novels. So we'll talk about Gerald Gine tomorrow. But before that, now the floor is open for comments, for questions, and because recording is also going on, so make your question brief and make your comment interesting. Now I'm not going to address, say, any question at the moment. I'll just listen, sit back and relax. Yes, you can unmute yourself when you speak. One last point I must make. It is not a point, rather it has something to do with this entire series of lectures. You know that theory is one subject which is a concern not only of literature students but also students of social sciences and students of media and students of many other disciplines. You know that one important definition of theory, and let us talk about it very quickly. When we say it is theory, then we ask this question, what is this theory of? And you say, okay, this is theory of culture. And culture subsumes many important subjects, many important disciplines. Whether there are students from social sciences or even from engineering. Is Ansab there? Anyway, so if we think about the nature of theory, one important aspect of theory is its interdisciplinary nature. That means it is interdisciplinary. We talk about history, we talk about psychology, we talk about philosophy, we talk about literature, we talk even some subjects like architecture. This entire idea of post-modernism actually originates from architecture. And that's why in this class you have participants from different fields also. So sometimes it can also work like a kind of university extension lecture for many. for you, this is the kind of basic program, but for this is also functioning as a kind of series of extension lectures. Right now,
Sir, Sabur here. So basically, when we talk about Baths, we look at him as
who
a
is speaking? Who is?
Sir Sabur Khudwai, sir.
Oh, Sabur, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So, sir, when we talk about Baths, we look at him as a structuralist, as we are doing now, but he's also, as you said, a post-structuralist. And post-structuralism talks about the explosion of meaning and how meaning collapses after close reading, after a second reading. So, how does meaning work in structuralism? How does the meaning of meaning change in structuralism and in post-structuralism when we look at Baths? So that was my question.
Sabur, your question is very important, and since we will be discussing post-structuralism in great detail, so let us just wait for those lectures, because Barth will be relevant there also. So I take your question, and your question obviously is important, and here I'll have to talk about the nature of post-structuralism as well as the nature of structuralism. We already know what structuralism is, but since we'll be talking about post-structuralism also, and Barth is relevant there also, and Barth stands at a kind of juncture where he sees both structuralism and post-structuralism. So we'll come back to this question, please. Right?
Yes, thanks.
I wanted to ask a question, if I may. Yes?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir, you spoke about highbrow structuralists and lowbrow structuralists. Why this difference? Why this category?
It is
I mean, on what basis is this?
Yes. On what basis it is? Simple. You see, if you ask any student of literature, everyone probably knows Michel Foucault. Everyone probably knows Roland Barthes, right? But very few students or know somebody like Prof. It is only when you explore this subject deeper that you come to know about the contribution of these men. So these are hard-working critics. Barthes also qualifies as a creative writer. That means even if you are not interested in criticism, you can read Barthes. Even if you are not interested in certain kind of writing, you can read Barthes, right? So that's why this particular distinction, where you have certain lesser mortals in a relative sense, somebody like Gérald Genet, and they themselves are say very modest about their aims. When Gérald Genet writes the preface of his work, he is very modest. And see another interesting distinction. Barthes writes essay, and it's a kind of star performance. There is absolutely no reference at the end. So Barthes is doing that kind of say eloquent. He's giving that kind of eloquent speech. No reference whatsoever. And in Gérald Genet, there are about 4 pages of references. So that means he belongs to that tradition of scholars who work hard, who are, say, possibly spending a lot of time, who are modest in their aims, and who are not celebrated as such everywhere. So that is the difference. Although probably now Gérald Genet is considered very important, and at that time he was very modest about his aims, but today, say, any student of narratives cannot do without Gérald Genet's categories.
Thank you.
So I needed to ask one more question. I'm Zahid Mushtaq.
Yes, I.
Actually, when we are talking about this narratology, doesn't it strike us to also discuss about Mikhail Bakhtin and the reader response critiques such as him, with their concepts of dialogue and heteroglossia,
Yeah, thank you, Zahid. You see, Bakhtin is the fiercest critic of structuralism. And since it will require a very detailed discussion, let me put it very clearly. Structuralism considers long very important, and Bakhtin considers living speech very important. So for Bakhtin, it is parole. And for Bakhtin, language is a kind of dialogic affair. So it is not those abstract rules, but rather so the actual work. And of course, you know that Bakhtin is also the most important critic who wrote on novels, right? So yes, Bakhtin you can mention, but Bakhtin requires a different, say, series altogether, right?
So I was saying this because doesn't it somehow relate to the concept proposed by Ferdinand de Saussure about science? Ferdinand de Saussure doesn't talk about science in as